Museum Price here in Oakland. I want to start off with if you could tell me about your background, your childhood, and who your people are.
Yeah, well, my family's from Ohio, and we know from one side of the family that they were enslaved in Virginia and came to Ohio. So on one side, I can really trace that they came to Ohio and served as domestics, chauffeurs, and that kind of thing. Um, and another side of the family had come from Georgia up to Tennessee. So my family roots are really in Ohio. That's where my parents are both from. That's where they met, and that's where I was born.
With your upbringing and childhood, were there moments as you were growing up that brought you to do the work that you do?
Most definitely. I think that I grew up in Wisconsin, and that's where I spent most of my childhood, and in a suburb outside of Milwaukee. So I was one of those kids, like the only black kid in a class situation, for a lot of my life. And my mom was a teacher, and she taught in schools in Milwaukee. And my dad spent some time as a lawyer, like representing like tenant law, right? Like helping people in public housing. So my parents, they took me to work with them. And I remember like one of my mom's schools, just how under-resourced it was, how it kind of looked like a jail. And all the things that I had that was not in the school. And I think my mom wanted me to see that very intentionally without ever telling me or saying anything. And then my dad had represented some clients across the street where those kids were from at one point in his career. So it really gave me a sense of inequity, of like this is wrong. And, my parents were active in the civil rights movement. My dad was involved in the welfare rights movement. My mom would, go on marches and stuff during the civil rights movement. So I just feel like it's kind of in me, and it always felt like fighting for justice was something that was in me from a young age. What I'm trying to do in my own work is to, one, really bring about a greater understanding around wealth writ large, right? How it was accumulated, what are the methods of extraction, how do they look, what do they look like? And I feel like we need to push to a broader sense of what wealth is, not just the financial, but what it really bestows, right? I think that a lot of times how we talk about wealth is very narrow and sometimes inaccurate, right? In terms of how people accumulate wealth. So we tend to think about what I call the mac and cheese, the trifecta, right? It's education, it's home ownership, right? It's entrepreneurship. And so we get into this kind of loop about that's how we're going to put this work out there. And I say that because I talk about this all the time, and I go in front of audiences in all different places and still see that we have a lot of misconceptions. And I think even what we feed to young people about what they need to do to get wealthy, right? And push these notions on them around, for example, like starting a business. I'm not saying don't start a business, but we see that as like almost an automatic path to wealth, home ownership, an automatic path. And I just think, what would it be like if we could actually, if young people who could get this quite quickly, if we could lean on their imagination and their creativity on how to address this issue. and how to educate others. I've worked in areas where I've seen young people who can educate their own families, who can go out and educate their communities and move them and galvanize them, and they can do this on this issue. But how are we setting them up to do it? Where does that exist? I'm like, what kind of program exists to help them do that? So I would love to see more investment in that ability to see that young people could get this issue quite quickly and then be creative about how to start to dig in on it.
I saw you use a phrase, umbrellas don't make it rain.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you and Darity and Mr. Derek Hamilton worked on that. Can you expound on that?
Yeah, it kind of gets back to language, right? So the way that we kind of can understand issues is through like metaphors. And I want to use a metaphor to be able to explain this issue, like to really flip the script on our thinking about what drives these kinds of inequities. What's the driver, right? And so umbrellas don't make it rain was really a way to say, like, look, it's not education that's causing these issues, it's wealth, right? So that was a way for us to kind of enter into more of a discussion around what's really at play here. That's counter to what people think, most Americans think.
Can you tell me about your work surrounding racial equity and the racial wealth gap? Do you think that maybe calling it racial should be changed? Like using the word racial should be changed?
Well, I would say that I kind of have issues around calling it the racial wealth gap. And I'm probably alone in many cases in saying that. And there's a reason why. I don't think the racial part really is the issue. I think the gap part is the issue. And I say that because like our mental models around a gap is something kind of natural, like the Grand Canyon, right? So when we think about gaps, oftentimes it doesn't spur us to action. It doesn't say we need to do something, right? Because, embedded in that is something natural. And this is a completely man-made problem, right? So I don't think the issue about race and calling out race specifically is the issue. I think the way sometimes we talk about those inequities doesn't give people a place to go, right? Because it's so immense, right? It's so deep-seated. So, a lot of folks say, well, what can I do, right? It's like it seems so embedded in our economy, which it is. Well, when we think about really all that's been extracted from Black people, right? And we don't have a way to know all of it. But when we think about what we do know, when we think about $326 billion of stolen wealth just from land alone from Black people, when we think about what was denied Black people from Social Security, somewhere over 143 billion. You start adding up all these aspects of extraction. And what we see in terms of differences of wealth between white people and Black people is a culmination, is a sum of many, many actions, policies, modes of extraction that happened over generations to get us to this place. So, this will actually help us narrow those differences, right? Because when people say, hey, we're going to close the racial wealth gap, I hear it all the time. I'm like, do you know what's involved there? You know what it would take to really narrow something that's really predicated on 400 years. So it's the only way, if we're going to really think about narrowing racial wealth differences, reparations is the only means to get us close enough to do that. Like, we need reparations, and we'd still need to continue to do things that would keep extraction from happening. So it's not like it's going to solve everything, but it certainly would narrow significantly those differences and make up, to some extent, those 400 years. I think that there is a bottom line, so to speak, when we think about adding all of these pieces up, right? And it's extensive, it's massive, even a massive project to be able to look at all the aspects of Black lives over history, during slavery, during Reconstruction and Jim Crow, and really be able to get to that one figure. So I think that one figure is really important for us to see that sum. Sometimes I feel like breaking up, talking about various issues helps people get a sense of what makes up wealth, right? And I think this is so important because a lot of people don't understand how wealth is actually accumulated. How do people in this country actually accumulate wealth? It's so foundational, but there's really a lack of understanding of how that was done. We think about it as individual people who did amazing things and somehow they got wealthy, like the Carnegies or Rockefellers, but really don't understand that the government, actually built wealth for white people and how they did it, the mechanisms in which they did it, the various ways in which that came about.
Construction work on water conservation projects requires an immense number of skilled and unskilled workers, providing immediate employment for hundreds of those who would otherwise be on relief. Those who suffered because of the drought are now employed on projects designed for their own future benefit.
Those pieces, whether that be land, whether that be, through, workforce, policies and, the ways in which Black people were funneled into certain jobs. All of that matters in terms of people's understanding of what this is. So, you give a figure, it's so outrageous, it's so astronomical that people can't wrap their heads around it, right? I think it has to be chunked out for people to see it in a certain way.
Florida schools must now teach students about the, quote, benefit of slavery when teaching Black history. The controversial new education standard passed by the State Board of Education earlier this week. Now, this follows Governor DeSantis' so-called Stop Woke Act, which forced the rewriting of education standards there in Florida.
Yeah, I think a lot about the aspects of reparations, which you have to really think about healing. You have to have an acknowledgement. So I want to just kind of start there, because imagine if we actually had an acknowledgement. Right now, we're having discussions, about whether slavery was beneficial to Black people. Like, look where we are, right? To actually acknowledge what was done, to understand really our history that we want to turn away from. I think that is such a crucial step. And how do we actually heal from this deep wound? I think the idea, when we think about paying people what's owed them, is part of a healing to me, right? It is part of that acknowledgement. So it's not just saying, hey, we need people to have greater understanding, but actually carrying that out to action, which to me, reparations is, right? The full breadth of reparations is doing all of those things, right? I think we'd be a different country.
So, when we're speaking about slavery and the extension of the modern day workforce, can you give some points so that the overall public knows how they correlate?
Yeah, I think, one, what did we really learn about slavery in school? Not much. I was just talking about this with my brother the other night, and he's like, I don't think I remember being taught much of anything about slavery. Um, so I think that one thing to really understand is how slavery really did form the way our country operates today. Modern business practices came out of slavery, right? We think about vertical integration, we think about collateral, startups, all of those kinds of concepts came from slavery. Now, when it comes to our workforce, you think about the way that violence and torture was used to extract profit. I think something like from 1801 to 1862, there was a 400% increase in productivity in cotton, right? And that was all from torture. That was all from violence, right? And surveillance, right? So what does that have to do with today? We have to think about these systems as being very sophisticated. This wasn't like what we think someone was like on a plantation and someone was riding around on a horse and saying, get to work. Like, this was meted out very carefully, right? I mean, people knew how much cotton needed to be picked, right? So they had to be surveilled and had to be carefully watched in everything that they did. So think about our modern workforce. Think about methods of surveillance. Think about when people are told they have 15-minute breaks, that you can't spend too much time in the bathroom. Think about how companies are trying to really, really minimize, right, movements in production to actually get more profit, right? We might not see, obviously, that kind of violence and torture, but the concepts and the mechanisms and where we learned this from really did come from slavery. We can see extensions from where we are now from our past and why these conditions exist in almost every facet of life, from mass incarceration. And when we think about the level of control and controlling Black bodies, and also extracting from Black communities, pulling people literally out of communities, impoverishing those families who have members of their family in institutions. All of this is quite intentional, right? And it obviously has generational effects. And then you look at issues like, I'm looking at the issue of occupational segregation, which is really the effect of people being unnaturally crowded into certain jobs. We tend to think of the labor force as pretty natural, like you have a desire, you have a career goal, you go out, you seek that career goal, and you get hired, and then you get hired maybe on an entry level, then you move up, then you're a manager and a supervisor. And when we look at our labor market, it's just extremely racially segregated, and it just doesn't happen that way for Black people, regardless of their education, regardless of their training, right? That this is something that affects us no matter what our position is, across class. And it impacts Black people quite differently. And we don't take a look at what that means when you're talking about income that is lost across generations, right? And this is like, maybe in someone's lifetime, $1 million is lost. Is lost because of how they're pushed and locked into certain types of jobs. These are all man-made policies and decisions. So our public benefit system is the same. It's predicated on anti-Blackness and deservedness. We think about why it's so difficult for people to get benefits. We saw that during the pandemic. Why was it so hard for people to get unemployment? Because that system was set up for a lot of folks never to get unemployment. And who didn't get unemployment, and why didn't they get unemployment? Because what kind of jobs were they in? What states were they in, right? Those things all have historical roots that have manifested today that are quite punitive, that are predicated on anti-Blackness. Yeah, I think that we need to think about what is our intentional strategy, and like, who are our messengers, and how to position them to be able to be the best messengers, right? I think there's so much confusion and around what reparations is and why it's needed. I think certainly if folks can educate others about what it truly is, that's a huge step that certain celebrities could play. Educate themselves, actually. I think that could be a stepping stone, right? It could be an entree, right? What we need are some entree points to get the ear of folks, to get the hearts and minds of people who, feel so threatened. I mean, right now we're living in a time when people feel so threatened about their very existence, that it's hard for them to hear anything related to reparations, right? So how do we do this in a way that people can be heard? We can't make a movement without that, right? It doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree with this policy, certainly not, and everyone doesn't need to agree with it. But certainly we have a ways to go to really move people. Yeah, I really believe in starting with the local. I know others might not agree with me on that, but I think seeing you from where you are, how did this place come to be? How did the conditions, come to exist in the way that they are, and how groups were affected, how were Black people affected, really varies from place to place, right? And so I think people have a hard time first understanding wealth, because we tend to think about, Oprah or someone like, someone who is wealthy, that has wealth, but not understand the mechanisms in which it's like created. And I think you can see that in place. You can see how that looks in a certain place. How would it look here when we think about West Oakland or even East Oakland, right? Understanding how policies played a role, how they manifested. I think being able to have groups across the country that are working in a local level, but come together nationally, that can band together in coalition, that can move. First, you have to move people on the ground, and then be able to really build more of a national movement by folks coming together in those communities, I think is the way that we're going to have to move this, right? We're still at a very much of a starting place, right? I mean, this conversation can go all over the place, right? But I think starting with our communities is the best way to start.